Hello, I'm Elise Chaffins, and I'm here today with Matt Winn, the director and co-writer of the film The Trouble with Jessica, coming to theaters on April 25th here in the US. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Elise. Lovely to see you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love this is kind of a silly thing, but I love the repeated use of the clafouti throughout the film.
Oh,
Was there
yeah.
something special about that dessert, or was it just a fun word to
Um,
say?
yeah, it's a fun word to say. A lot of people have a lot of different ideas about how you say it, for a start. And are you familiar with clafouti?
Yeah, it's like a custard with fruit in
Yeah,
it. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, a lot of people think I thought it was Greek, it sounded Greek,
Okay.
you
Yeah,
know,
definitely.
and none of the cast knew what it was. And they were like, what is this? But Indira Varma had this way of saying it. Everyone had a different way of saying it as well. This word they'd never heard of. So I think Alan Tudyk was clafoutis, and Indira Varma, I can't remember how she accented it, but she says, they say, have you tried? It's like a sort of a rather sort of cheap sexual kind of innuendo where she says, have you tried Tom's clafouti? And she says, no, I've never tried Tom's what did you say? Clafouti. I can't remember how she pronounces it, but it sounds very, very cool. So, yeah, the idea basically, um, I'll give a bit of advertising. In London, there's a bakery chain. It's pretty upmarket called Gales, and it's very upper middle class. And
Okay.
and the idea, one of the ideas behind the film was, not just what would happen if you lost your house and lost everything you were familiar with, and the neighborhood and all your friends and the house you built and all. Not just that, but like your corner coffee shop. The little things. What terrible, dastardly things would upper middle class people be prepared to do to sort of maintain, not have to change baristas. That was part of the fun we were trying to have. So a few years ago, I remember going into Gales, and they were selling clafouti by the slice. And I thought, oh God, that's about the most at market thing they've got in the shop. So I had one. And then I think they stopped selling it. But I think it was, to me, that represented just the sort of height of kind of a rather specific kind of middle
Hmm.
class quality in a bakery, to sort of an indulgence, a certain thing that people kind of expected. But, when you look at it in terms of, goings on in the world and, the poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and the climate change and all this kind of stuff, the ability to get a slice of clafouti at your local Gale seems about the most um, insignificant thing that would be important. But to these people, it's still quite important. So, and also I wanted to find something that people didn't really know what it was, that
Mm.
sounded a bit shishi and obscure. And none of the cast knew what it was. I mean, some people, everyone in France knows what it is, it's like cheesecake with some blueberries in it. But
Mm.
it sounds quite upmarket. So that was the choice. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that kind of brings me to another thing is just uh, uh, with everyone, recently finishing up The White Lotus, and Parker Posey's character had that line that was, "At this age, I don't think I'm meant to live an uncomfortable life." It kind
Yeah.
of felt
And by
like,
the way, no spoilers because I've only got to episode 7. So,
okay, no
and
spoilers.
I read something that totally destroyed Amy Lou Woods and what the guy's character, and I was like, I wish people wouldn't. So I'm only on 7, but yes, I love Parker Posey in that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but that line in particular just kind
yeah.
of felt like it really kind of worked with this film, because I think there's a certain element of that we see with these characters of, well, I we can't, you know, allow this to go through because we have this, sale of our house coming.
Mm,
So
mm.
yeah, I think but these aren't like the ultra wealthy or anything here in this film. It's this middle class kind of thing. Can you talk just about examining that desire to have more, that kind of how that plays out in this film?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, you're right. It's a desire to have more, but it's also a desire to hang on to what you've got,
Mm.
and people often, you know, certainly in politics of the left, they kind of go, oh, it's terrible, this consumerist society and all this sort of stuff, and it's like, yeah, it is, but the reason everybody's obsessed with consumerism is, have you tried being poor recently?
Yeah.
And you can kind of say, oh, we don't need all these coffee shops on our high street. And that's fine, don't have them. But have you tried living on $12,000 a year? Because you really wouldn't like it. It's a whole different world. So I think those people fail to take into account um, they would love to criticize, they have a lot of, what's it called, the politics of sort of jealousy and that kind of
Mm.
thing. But it's these people just don't want to be poor, and that's sort of reasonable, because if somebody were to say to anybody that, maybe has an apartment and even at a decent, at a decent rental agreement, I know they have those ones in New York City where it's agreed at a low rise. Would you be prepared to give that away and all that sort of stuff that you've got because you were just around all that time? So that was part of what I was interested in examining, that everybody wants to hang on to what they've got, not just rich people. I mean, people that aren't rich. And also, I'm reading this really interesting book at the moment called Dopamine Nation. I don't know if you've heard of it. I think it was a bit of a
Mm.
New York Times bestseller. It's written by a psychiatrist from Stanford. And she makes the point that in the West, our brains were developed 500,000 years ago when there wasn't very much stuff around. And dopamine runs through our brains to make us go and forage for food and chase monkeys and spend 5 days trekking through the desert to get some water. But now, in the UK and America, you could stuff your face with burgers and hot chocolates and frappuccinos and all these different things, pizzas, and there's all this dopamine you can have right now. So it's, we're overindulged. Our brains are overindulged. So it's very difficult for us to sort of know when to stop,
Mm.
because our brains weren't meant for this kind of world, and that also means that people in the UK and the US are probably less happy than a lot of people in poorer countries, because we've got everything essentially. I mean, there's 25% of the population that are very poor, but everybody else has kind of got some nice stuff and, imported fruit. And we're just used to having this stuff. And we're a bit miserable, because we've got a bit too much of everything, and we want more, more, more. And it never fills us up.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So kind of doing a switch here. So the
Mm,
film has just a lot of comedic and farcical elements, but of course they're set against this really dark backdrop of Jessica's suicide. So can you
mm.
talk about, just as you're writing this and like kind of putting it together as a director, what it's like to kind of balance the tones between, these two really odd things of like there's this death by suicide, but then there's
Yeah,
also the how do we dispose of this body and
yeah, yeah.
preserve the sale of our home.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, myself and my co-writer James Handel, we sort of share a sensibility, and we didn't have that much problem with it, to be honest. But I
Mhm.
think that's because we found each other. We're like, often sort of writers and directors find each other, and they never want to let go because they share, either a lightness or a happy-go-lucky, feel-good quality. That's not what James and I share. We share a very dark, sort of get out the surgeon's knives and put all the characters under a microscope and let's start tearing them apart without any anesthetic whatsoever and see who's going to squeal if we cut their toes off first. And I mean, there was a couple of things going on here. I had an experience of suicide, so on a serious note, I was really quite interested to bring that subject up and put something in a movie, because you very rarely see it addressed. So a girlfriend of mine had committed suicide, and it's the kind of thing, I suppose, a bit like the loss of a child. It's like a terrible thing that most people don't encounter, but if you do encounter it, it puts you in the group of these people that have had this thing happen that's not, it's very unnatural. And it, I always think of it as a bit like somebody throwing a massive rock into a very sort of placid lake, and the ripples go out in all directions and they affect so many different people. I saw statistics once that said every suicide costs about £10 million or $12 million, just because of all the knock-on effects that you don't even think about. And I was certainly very affected, and I ended up actually selling my property because I just couldn't stand to live in the same area anymore.
Mm.
So there was that, and then also, I knew these two guys. We were sitting around thinking, we want to tell a story about middle class people under pressure, And we were thinking, what could that pressure be? And then I said, well, I knew these two guys who'd killed themselves in other people's gardens. They hanged themselves in other people's gardens. And one I didn't know that well, but one I knew pretty well, and he did it in an ex-girlfriend's garden, and I think there was a connection that he felt. I don't know.
Hmm.
The guy's dead. His phone number's
Right.
still in my phone. We don't get to ask him, but I kind of thought maybe it was a place where he felt he could do it. But I know from experience you don't want somebody killing themselves in your house. It's or in your garden for that matter, because
Yeah. No.
it's a good enough reason to sell the house. So we had that, and at the same time, we wanted to sort of make a very black comedy about middle class people. They're just not just middle class, because I know in America middle class means sort of more working class sometimes, but these are upper middle class people. They're super professionals. They're barristers. They're lawyers. They're making a ton of money. But even people that make a lot of money, can be unhappy, or they can be overstretched, or they can be in debt, or they can have unhappy marriages. And, it doesn't make you happy having a lot of money necessarily. And it's a film, I often think of all the sad billionaires there are out there. Every time the stock market rises and they make another 20%, I just think they're just even more miserable than they were last week, crying into their gold china cups. So we also wanted to think, okay, how can we put these guys through like the moral dilemma from hell? And we thought, okay, this happens in their garden. They're about to sell the house. What are they going to do? But we had to make sure that it wasn't a moral problem that was easy to resolve. So we went, well, what about, I mean, if you had, say, a member of your family, a son or a daughter who had leukemia and needed private healthcare. Well, for most parents, I think they'd break the law if they had to do that. That's what a parent's job is. But in this case, they don't have anything like that. All they have is, this is, I spent ages building this house up, and if we fall off the housing ladder, we'll never get back on.
Hmm.
And they don't want to be poor again. So, and it's not just that they don't want to be poor because they can't go on foreign holidays anymore, or it's more like because they like living in nice areas where there's nice coffee shops, and it's people like us, and like the little things. So that's really where the satire comes from. It's like, how much are these people prepared to do to hang on to their lifestyle? And I think the question is as well is that a lot of people think, well, I wouldn't do that. I'm not so selfish. They're desperately selfish. But I think if the chips were down for any of us, it's if suddenly fate were to blow in and say we're going to take everything away, I think a lot of people think, hold on a minute here, this isn't fair.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I also think it's kind of interesting because it allows them, and I think it's probably similar in a lot of like Western countries, we are deeply uncomfortable with death. And so the way that they're dealing with all of this kind of allows them to like gloss over the fact that their friend just died. So you have some of that kind of like testing morality too, I think, in this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think at one point Sarah says, "What are we going to do with the body?" And Beth says, "It's not a body, it's Jessica."
Right.
And she's our friend. And then Rufus Sewell's character said, "Well, she's more our friend really than your friend," which I think is so funny. The way he delivers that line is so sort of inappropriate at that moment. Because it's like, well, who was the better friend? It's like, this is not the point. It doesn't matter. But look, you can't have empathy for everybody. It's like that thing, isn't it? When you have a news story that says, um, 3 children drown in Nigerian lake. That's a sad story. But when it says 100,000 children die from malaria, it's just a statistic, isn't it? It's very
Hmm.
hard to you can't be sad 30,000 times more because it's less relatable. I think that's built into the human psyche, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you taking time to speak with me today. Thank you
Okay.
for this film, and yeah, yeah,
Oh, listen,
best
let
of
me
luck.